Welcome to the continuation of this practicum. The question, how can we propose from this image alone a process of establishing a diagnosis? This is the second part of this presentation. We're going to focus on signs and signals and how to synthesize them toward the establishment of a likely diagnosis. Because some of you may not have seen the first part, Part A, I invite you to do so in order to better grasp what follows. In the interest of brevity, the following comments are very much in brief. Fuller comments are given in the introduction. OmniNet presentations emphasize visual signs and the correlated medical terminology, with an emphasis on embryogenesis, fetogenesis, and dysmorphogenesis, which includes teratology and medical genetics. The nomenclature is entirely in English because the lingua franca in medicine is English. We give it for granted that viewers of this prolongation or the second part of this presentation have full knowledge of the meaning of these terms. Otherwise, please again refer to the first part, that is the introduction. Allow me to present myself, and you can learn more about me by visiting the link shown below. The facts we present are found in clinical eye openers in the perspective of clinical aspects, and in Pandora Word Box in the perspective of terminology. We emphasize here that to establish a diagnosis, we speak of a process. We emphasize that the process is energized by the curiosity of a clinician. In fact, I have the opinion that a clinician should be naturally curious. The judgments pronounced in the process of establishing a diagnosis unavoidably reflect the experience as well as the knowledge of the judge. Listening and hearing are two separate issues. Looking and seeing are two separate issues. Seeing and interpreting what you see as a signal is another issue, and so forth. We rely on an image by Albert Dürer because we believe it is a reliable legacy from 500 years ago. The pathology in those years was different, but we have no doubt that this is a correct clinical presentation by what was at the time considered a polymath. Dürer was an expert in many disciplines, which brings us to the term of math, mathema, mathematics. That means learning, and energized by his profound curiosity regarding human nature. Look at him. He paints very accurately what he sees. Therefore, we trust that the same applies to the image we have selected. And speaking of mathematics, we agree that 1 is 1 and 2 is 2, but is the right side the same like the left? Clinicians very often forget to pay attention to symmetry. This and this is not symmetric, but are his eyes symmetric? You decide. You're the judge. Symmetry. But in addition, there are proportions. This image shows proportions. This proportion to this proportion. And this image shows proportion, this proportion, and this proportion. Are these markers of morphogenesis? Are they distorted enough to say that they present this morphogenesis? And we mentioned the energy box, curiosity. We are curious. Why did he paint this so? After all, this is one of the major emperors of Europe. Maybe he would displease him by showing the nature of his nose or his chin. And this now is known as the facies, or characteristic face of a member of the Habsburg clan. Face characteristic becomes facies. Habsburg clan, and sufficiently specific to suggest a non-paternity event, a rather scandalous possibility. You may watch a video about this subject. So to repeat, proportions, morphogenesis, dysmorphogenesis. This morphology may reflect deformations, malformations, teratology, genetics, can cluster in dysmorphic syndromes, and in fact, those can be due to physical, mechanical causes as well. For instance, hyperthermia. Dürer was curious. We know this because he focused on anomalies of the face, and particularly in this instance on the ear. High set, low set, mal-rotated, bigger, smaller, in other words, otic, anotia, microtia, dysplasia, etc., etc. So, another reason to trust that his representations are accurate. Here is the upper lip, the bow, cupid bow, and a philtrum. Upper lip, cupid bow, and a philtrum. Should there be absence of these structures, the suggestions would be prenatal exposures to alcohol. That is what Dürer saw but could not interpret. To interpret this, it took over 500 years. So now we are ready to focus on this particular portrait. Open your eyes. Start by being a detective, a clinical detective. And a clinical detective has to have an open mind. It cannot be a prosecutor. Look at signs without being biased. You must be objective. Let's look. And you too, open your eyes. Collect the signs that are in front of our face. But we must be objectives. We must be free from preconception. It is a landmark of immature clinicians or naive ones who manifest a tendency to shoot off the hip, if you like, and immediately upon detecting a sign, they exclaim, "Aha, I know what it means. That is a bad sign." After you collect your signs, then you are in a position to become a judge. Judge their significance. Which of those signs you could interpret as signals, and that depends on your experience and your knowledge. And then you can group those signs by commonalities, either shared mechanisms that you suspect or shared causes, and you may call those clusters of concurrent signs as syndromes. But do avoid premature diagnoses. That is a very destructive habit. Consider mechanisms first. How did these signs come to be? And following that, you may then venture into what could have been the causes to create these pathways of maldevelopment. Again, avoid the diagnosis until all alternatives and all additional signs and signals, the possibility of finding them have been exhausted. And now we enter the third phase, which distinguishes the lazy, incompetent, slovenly, unenthusiastic clinicians from those who are superior. It requires energy, it requires curiosity. And that is, every patient deserves some degree of clinical investigation. That is, what do others have seen? Not what others necessarily interpret, for that is the way we establish dogma or medical religions. The emphasis on a clinical investigation beyond the patient, or what we routinely call literature review, should be on casuistics. what were the facts observed and not only interpretations or generalizations. The focus further on should be then on what were the possible mechanisms or what were the possible agents that triggered these mechanisms. I understand that this interpretation is idealistic, but that is the only way medicine will evolve as a science. Otherwise, it will be a religion. And engaging in this sort of a sequence cascade of procedures, you may become ready for a synthesis, an overall synthesis of pathogenesis and causes or etiology, and then which diagnoses fit to what you already have synthesized. So the synthesis of a diagnosis is a long, complex process. But the important fact is that fact are science. And if you start with a false start, you end up with a false synthesis. You must include differential alternatives, and those may call for additional search of science signals, etc. In essence, any complex clinical situation is a unique clinical investigation. When you reach the point of a diagnosis, the whole edifice may collapse if it doesn't fit the natural history. For instance, should you make a brilliant diagnosis of Down syndrome and the patient is a genius and an astronomer, I think natural history of that patient will demolish your hypothesis. In this instance, you have a baby or a young person on the left, and if that person becomes miraculously cured, then you might reconsider the diagnosis that I am going to postulate in the next module. In essence, diagnoses are hypothetical, signs are objective, diagnoses may not be static, they may require updates. But of course, there is always somebody who is first, no casuistic. You may be the first one observing a novel pathology, or a new syndrome, or an original, previously unreported diagnosis, or the consequences of a de novo mutation of a particular gene. So that window again has to be kept open. So, I mentioned before and I mentioned now that in this portrait I see 4 signs of medical clinical relevance. They may be positive or negative. Do you? Which are they? What are these signals? Well, the signs I see is macrocephaly, alopecia, ear asymmetry and dysplasia, and strabismus that is unilateral. What hypothetical syndrome may I propose that causes an enlarged head and a squint? And what etiology could this pathogenesis reflect? And how can I put all of these factors into a single synthesis we'll call diagnosis? Then we need to test what I'm proposing. Then we need to repeat the synthesis, and then we reframe the hypothesis, either confirming, changing, or denying. Shown here are the ideas and notions exposed by the terms alluded to during the first and second portions of this presentation. We have reached the end of Part B. After speaking of signs, signals, and facies, we'll continue in Part C to present a synthesis dealing with the hypothetical pathogenesis, etiology, and diagnosis. To better grasp what will follow, please consider seeing Part A and B. And I thank you for your attention. I hope you visit us in Part C very soon, and until then, accept my best wishes. Goodbye.